Russell escaped almost every summer to his cabin and studio in the mountains of Glacier National Park, where he hiked, sketched, and painted en plein air, studying the wealth of wildlife that surrounded him. Now, there are only a handful of Russell's sketchbooks that remain and a very small number of his plein air studies, which you can see here. These are wonderful little working documents that help us trace Russell's color palette, brushwork, and the points of interest that he found in the park. So you can even see down below in the left corner with the deer, that's actually a sketchbook that's intact, fully forming the rings. These are all at the Ammon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. But Russell, he would take a little portable easel and palette with him and, as part of his hiking gear. And then he'd pull these little cut squares of canvas out, paste them on his easel, and then start painting. And then he could sneak them back into his box when he was done and just sort of keep them safe. We actually have example of this box that he took. The CM Russell Museum in Great Falls has, and it's always fun to put that on display and show how artists really were able to navigate this rough terrain. So the impetus behind much of Russell's plein air paintings was a fellow artist and illustrator named Philip R. Goodwin, who you can see in the top left photo behind Russell. Russell had befriended Goodwin while in New York and invited him out on several occasions to stay at Bullhead Lodge. Here you see Goodwin and Russell pose for a photograph as they used tump lines to carry their gear. While Russell often complained about the difficulties of writing, his humorous and insightful letters were always eagerly received by friends. So you can see the letter at right, Russell hanging on to dear life with a mountain goat watching him. And so I'll read that in portion. Quote, "I have just returned from the Glacier, Bill. They say the trail has been improved a lot since you were up. That may be, but it will need some more fixing before the goats are troubled with arrows. It's a good trail for airships. They have a rope on the last climb now, and when I got a holt, it was mine all right. And Kid Curry or no other holdup could take it with all the guns in the state. This is the nearest heaven ever I was. And if the trail is the same all the way, I'll never make it. It's a cinch I'll go south." Unquote. So you can kind of see there his sort of humorous takes on his situation. He pokes fun at himself and really enhanced by his, of course, his ability to illustrate. And I just want to mention here too that approximately 1/4 of Russell's entire artistic output and more than half of his bronzes feature wildlife subjects, which made Glacier Park an attractive place to set up and paint for him. And Russell as well, you know, he did go hunting with his buddies and his friends, but he really wasn't one to shoot. He did own a lot of hunting guns and pistols though. But he didn't like killing animals. That kind of stems from his time down working for this trapper named Jake Hoover out of Utica, Montana. You know, they would both, Jake would close his eyes when he was trying to shoot his pigs to eat and stuff like that. And so that kind of carried on through the Russell about this intention and care for animals. And so you can see on the right, this photograph actually comes from one of the Russell albums. And it's in the estate in Gilcrease Museum in Tulsa, Oklahoma. But the deer just out there, Russell used to put salt licks around where he lived for the deer to be attracted. And here are just some fun shots of Russell painting from the porch on the cabin. And so you can see kind of how I was able to give material like this to Jeannie. And so then she could use this in her illustrations and drawings to paint. So that's kind of what he looked like when he was painting fully his works. So in the next few slides, I'll touch on Russell's sentimental and intimate works that he created for his friends. Russell was lovely in the way that he took the time to craft these little gems as gifts or takeaways for special occasions like Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries, dinner parties, or in some cases, just to drop a hello to a friend. And it is out of Russell's generous spirit of giving where we see his gnomes and little creatures spring forth. So the painting at the bottom was given as a Christmas present to Josephine Trigg. Josephine, her mother and father were Great Falls neighbors of the Russells and their closest friends. So Storm on Lake McDonald, which you see here, is one of my favorite paintings that he ever made. I think it has such pathos, such beautiful brushwork and movement. So if you get the opportunity to visit the C.M. Russell Museum in Great Falls, please do. The Josephine Trigg collection, which is composed of about 150 works given to the family over the course of their long friendship, contains some of Russell's most interesting and unusual works. Josephine Trigg was a children's librarian, local children's librarian, and she had such a great love of reading. She and Russell would trade each other books. And so Russell would often extra illustrate some of the novels that she gave, like some Mark Twain, or just create these little Friar Tuck sculptures and just some of these wonderful little things that are quite unlike his, commercial artwork that he's well known for here. And also this little drawing of her up top. It's just he drew that while she was reading a book, and it's just a sweet little way to capture her portrait. These two little paintings were made from strips of birch bark that Russell took from the trees in Glacier Park. Russell used birch bark in a variety of his art, from greeting cards to stumps for gnomes and even napkin rings and other centerpieces from parties that the family threw. The works here were gifts to Kitty and Robert Roberts, close friends of both Nancy and Charlie. The couple actually got married in the Russell's living room in 1905 and then spent a few weeks honeymooning at Bullhead Lodge. And so these are little mementos that Russell made for them to mark the special occasion. And so it's just sort of, again, Russell being sweet and sentimental. And this photograph here shows A.J. Trigg, which was Josephine's dad, and a sort of surrogate father figure for Russell. He's also a trusted neighbor and friend. The watercolor here shows a grouse in a tree with a little lamentation that hunting season has not yet arrived, so they are unable to harvest the park's game and must instead rely on eating the provisions that they brought with them. So that's just kind of, again, these little gifts that Russell would be thoughtful and use and give to people that weren't around. And this is another beautiful little greeting card that Russell made in 1906 to mark the occasion of his newly built cabin. It was actually called Kootenai Lodge at first, to sort of pay homage to the Kootenai people, because this area of the park in West Glacier was sort of their ancestral home and hunting grounds. But Nancy, the ever thoughtful business partner and wife, decided to have it renamed Bullhead Lodge in order to sort of correspond with Russell's famous signature, which was a bison skull that he would do next to his initials and his names, which you can see in the photograph there, in the painting. So it became Bullhead Lodge. And I can assure you, I've included two images that I was so lucky to be able to visit Bullhead Lodge some years ago. And so these are my images of them. And as I said, I can assure you it is still magical and mossy to come upon in the woods. And perhaps one day it'll be under the care and stewardship of the National Park and the C.M. Russell Museum. But as of now, it's privately owned, so you can't just sort of walk up and go in and visit it. But it's definitely a super special place and well deserving of, being preserved. So as an artist, and especially as a sculptor, Russell's art was intimately connected to his sense of touch, his knowledge of material things, his dexterity and ability to manipulate forms from one entity into another. His imagination fed off the sensations of touch, and he used debris from the natural world to fashion unique and captivating found object sculptures. Here you can see two of his delicate beeswax sculptures that have been paired with gnarled tree roots to create quaint little wildlife scenes. One a mother and her cubs searching for grub, and the other a fox treeing two turkeys. These are both in the collection of the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, who has a great many of Russell's little special little plaster wax gnarled tree root sculptures. And the photograph there shows Russell with the Howard Eaton party. Howard Eaton was one of the first dude ranchers, and he brought a lot of Easterners out west. And, he had Russell along as part of the artist entertainment for people. So you can see, even in this photograph, it is kind of a stage photograph. They had official photographers there, but how engrossed people really were by Russell and his just ability to sculpt and make art. You know, he was sort of a fiddler, I suppose, because he would always have a piece of beeswax that he used to carry in his pocket, and he'd just always be molding. And so he'd create a little creature, put it out on the table, and then smack it and create something else. And, you know, he'd create creatures out of carved soap, out of bread, and, you know, sometimes he'd give it as presents or gifts, so people would just take it from the table when they saw him creating these things, because, again, even though he's known for his paintings, sculpture was sort of his first artistic media that he gravitated towards as a child. And because Russell was such a prolific sculptor, he would often make models for himself to use to aid him in his paintings. So as I said, like three-dimensional forms were much easier for him to craft than paintings were. So here in this image and the next one, we can kind of see how Russell utilized photography to capture these little diorama scenes that he could then use as painting aids. And it's fun that, you know, he would stage these in sort of the undergrowth of, you know, Bullhead Lodge Glacier area. And you can see a teepee and two Indian figures set here. And then above, a model cabin with a man and his saw. They're about to, you know, saw down some logs and trees. And then to the right, and I blew it up a little bit, is a deer you can see just moving through the foliage. And so, yeah, he'd study these and then sort of get a sense of how to craft them for his paintings. And when he was back in the studio in Great Falls, he would often do this with plaster works, and then he'd light them and see how the shadows hit them and fell, and be able to better render that in 3D work, in 2D work, excuse me. So for Russell, Bullhead Lodge was a special environment, removed from daily life and thus open to play, a greater use of one's imagination, and the possibility of enchantment and partnerships in seeking shared enrichment of the natural environment. Here, in a world dressed in romance and nostalgia, Russell and his friends could inhabit new and different identities, fashion magical creatures using the power of art, and escape the heaviness of the modern world. And so these are some fun photographs. Russell sort of in drag in one photograph, Russell's housekeeper and actually Jody Young's mother playing dress up, reminiscing back to the gay 90s, which were the 1890s then. And then Russell and his niece Isabel sort of dressed up in native clothing in order to pose and photograph for his artworks. So one such willing and eager participant in fashioning worlds of their own creation was a man by the name of Jody Young. He grew up in Oklahoma Territory and learned how to wrangle cattle and work on ranches as a young man. His dream was to work in Hollywood Westerns, but as a teenager, he contracted meningitis, which left him deaf and threw off his internal balance. It took him 6 months to learn how to walk again after he did that. But lucky for him, he could ride faster than he learned to walk. And his other passion, while besides cowboying, was art. And his attraction to the works of Charles Russell eventually led him to Montana and becoming Russell's only protege. Because DeYoung was deaf, the two communicated through notes and through sign language. So we also try to utilize that in the book, and Jeannie was so great in putting some of that sign language aspect into her drawings and illustrations. And I just think it sort of captures, again, how the two pair work together and the interest. Just showing, there's a variety actually of deaf artists that paint the American West, and maybe that'll be exhibit someday. And you can see up top there in the Buckaroo an example of Joe Young's style and work, kind of similar to Russell, but a different palette. After 1912, Joe became a regular at Bullhead Lodge and took an interest, like Russell, in sculpting and enhancing their enchanted forest environment through works of art. Here you can see privacy screens with pictures and names and visitors, and the photograph of the cabin, a modeled boat the pair took sailing, and incised drawings that Russell made with Philip Goodwin. So again, this place was just filled with art and artists, you know, drawing all over the place and having fun. Before they divided the cabin up into a few rooms, they used these privacy screens, and you can see the example here for people when they were sleeping, and they had artists draw on them, and if you were a visitor to the cabin that year, you got to write your name, or your name was painted on the screen. And so these actually endure as records, and the C.M. Russell Museum has a number of them, as does the Montana Historical Society. And I'll just make a note about the fireplace. All those drawings were done by Philip Goodwin and Russell. They almost burnt the house down when they were doing it. They forgot to clean the chimney before that and had some smoke and craziness, but they still are there today, and it's so wonderful to be able to see them. And then here's just a wonderful photograph of a group of visitors to the cabin and the interior of what it looks like. And you can see lined up along the mantle are a bunch of the gnome creatures. Russell would place these gnomes throughout the property and would also gift them to friends. And so the gnome here with a jug of alcohol was given to John Lewis, who was proprietor of Lake McDonough Lodge, where Russell would hang out and have his artwork hung for sale to park visitors. But you can just, again, see an example of sort of the range of little works that he did. And of course, back in the day, how do you entertain each other, play games, make art, have fun? And so it's just kind of an example of what people were doing when they were getting together. And so here are some wonderful little black and white photographs that were taken of Russell and Goodwin looking down at the gnomes, and a few that were guarding the environment of the cabin. These three guys are some of the very few figures that we have survived. We are so lucky to have them. There is, I don't know, I would say maybe 10 or less at the C.M. Russell Museum, maybe a few sprinkled at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West and down at the National Cowboy. But for them to survive as long as birch bark and moss and even mushroom stump, and you can see the sort of pirate figure in the middle. It's on a sort of fungi. Again, one says the level of care that as these were given as gifts, some came through the studio collection, but the care that actually people took in saving and preserving them because they were so specially made. And then, of course, Jeannie's beautiful little illustration of how she sort of funded. And then here are the two big guardian gnomes that stood at the post and entrance of the cabin every summer. They were there to keep watch when the cabin's occupants were away, making sure the mice, bugs, rats, and birds didn't tear the place apart in their absence. And so these are the biggest gnomes that I think Russell made, or that we have one depictions of. There's only, in all of Russell's work, other people that write about Russell in Glacier Park mention these sort of gnome characters, but Russell only really mentions them once in one illustrated letter. And he calls them his guardians. And he says that they were sleeping on the job and that the rats took over and all the bugs. So these are the two biggest ones. And you can see here that they have the Bullhead Lodge insignia on their shields. And so while enchantment was important, both Russell and DeYoung shared a passion for Plains Indian culture, religion, and philosophy, which informed their artwork and their approach to the relationship to the land, wildlife, and spirituality. These moorings were important touchstones for the pair's philosophical attraction toward primitivism, a belief in fate, and the desire for spiritual harmony between man and nature. So prominent in Blackfeet mythology is the figure of Napi, the trickster god, and the little people or spirits who are said to inhabit the forest. Both Russell and DeYoung created a number of works of art dealing with these figures, a few of which you can see here. For me, Russell's drawing of DeYoung communicating in sign language with the mythical little people just underscores my belief that Bullhead Lodge and Glacier Park served as havens of enchantment for the two artists, where they can make believe that their art had truly come to life and was in playful interaction with the timeless spirits of the forest. And it's a topic I do hope to explore further one day. Joe especially was interested in these Napi figures. Russell did some illustrations for Frankfurt Linderman, who was an amateur ethnographer and author and he translated a lot of Cree stories and Blackfeet stories. And so Russell did some illustrations for him on that. Russell also created these beautiful little creatures to the right. You can see of Nappy riding on a duck and talking with chipmunks and painting the colors of bugs. These are all tie into Blackfeet stories about Nappy the trickster god. And Jody Young has a series of illustrations that he wanted to do, and he actually wanted to create a book about these figures, but it was never published to my understanding. But a lot of the drawings reside at the Sam Russell Museum. And up top, we wanted to add this sort of aspect, the fact that the Kootenai people, this was an important spiritual place for them in Lake McDonald, and sort of to kind of hint at the mythology and the interest in the spirituality of the Native people in this landscape, and how they are just an important tie-in, not only to Russell's art and his respect, but again, to the area itself. And there you can see the photograph, the painting that I used sort of as my inspiration for the whole book. I was trying to think of what painting could work, how could I tie this together, what could make them finish this. And so this was the work that sort of inspired me to sort of finish my story, incorporate the Kootenai people into it, and tie Russell's interest in Native American mythology, spirituality, into his artwork, because really he had such a tie to the Native American people, and he was well thought of by all the different tribes there, and actually did some political work on behalf of the Rocky Boy Cree, Chippewa Cree people. So in conclusion, I believe that Charles Russell was an artist who sought to depict subject matter that was unique to the American experience, which he found in the dynamic and fluctuating history of the American West. While he never spoke of himself as a fine artist, his legacy undercuts his humility, leaving a body of work richly grounded in authentic detail, as it depicts a deep sensitivity to the natural world and a nuanced understanding of human nature. To be labeled a great artist is a rare feat, but perhaps the ultimate honor is to be remembered as a good man and a true friend. And by that measure, Charles M. Russell cashed in. Thank you so much.